Okay, I think I'm going to get started here. So I know not everybody's here, but I am going to be recording this so that everybody else can listen later. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and interrupt me. You can also ask a question by typing and chat, and we'll see how it works. This is the first time I've tried this, so I'm glad that you guys have made it so far, and yeah, let's see how it goes. So the reason I wanted to do this is because we've already missed so many days with the snow, and it looks like that the semester will be extended. I don't know if you guys know about this, but it looks like it will at least have one extra Monday on May 4th. So we'll have some time to make up for some of the missed lecture time, but as much as possible, I want to use the time that we already have here. All right, so today we're changing gears a bit. The last couple of classes we were talking first about sort of like macro social issues with environmental science, and now we're switching to the biology component of it. So both focusing on here population biology, evolution, adaptation. Then the next class will go to community ecology and interactions between species. And then after that, we're sort of going up in scale into ecosystem science and forests and so on. So today we're dealing with population biology and evolution, and I'm actually going to tackle these in reverse order here. So we're talking about the species concept. What is a species? How do species arise? What are the mechanisms that generate new species? Some of the evidence for evolution in brief. I don't have nearly enough time to cover all of it, but just some of the main lines of evidence that we have for why this is happening. And some examples of evolution in action here. And then the last bit, I'm going to talk about population biology and really just some of the basic principles of population biology. So what I mean by that is how do you measure population growth? What are different forms of population growth, different strategies that species use, and this idea of density dependence. So that population biology is a bit more theoretical, but those sort of theoretical foundations will become useful when we talk about the higher levels of organization, the community ecology and ecosystem ecology. So what is a species? The idea that you can have something that's a distinct entity that's a different from all other things, it's actually not as clear-cut as you might think. So you might think, okay, we have, sugar maple is a species and a red maple is a species, and dogs are species. But then there's things where, for instance, within dogs, we have many different breeds of dogs, right? Those are all still the same species, even though they look so different from one another. So there can be a lot of variation within a species, these sort of called subspecies or varieties, that when you think about it, you might think that they are distinct as well. But in biology, we define species by organisms that can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. So it's a very...
Are the slides supposed to be moving?
Sorry, go ahead.
Because they're not moving.
Oh, you don't see species?
Yeah, we can't see the new slide. Or I can at least.
All right.
I can't.
Does anybody else see the species concept slide?
No.
Okay. Dang it.
No.
All right.
There it is.
That did it.
Now you see it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's try it like this.
Yes.
Uh-huh. Now, do you see it as like a lecture presentation?
No.
Yes, that's better.
It's like I'm editing it. Okay.
No, we see your menu.
Like you see my cursor and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just try it like this and see how it goes. Okay. All right. Well, all those things still apply. So that's what the species concept is in biology. It's members of a group that can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. So species is any members that can theoretically breed with another. In terms of members that actually live in the same area, that's what we consider a population. So that means that sugar maples in Massachusetts, that's a pretty broad area. The population might be just sugar maples around the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. That would be one population. So a population is a subset of the entire species that live in the same area. And then just to define evolution, in evolution we're talking about the change over time of a species. And that is the genetic change that happens at the level of populations. So populations can evolve at slightly different rates from one another within a species. And these genetic changes lead to modifications in their appearance or behavior. So that's the definition of evolution. So evolution is the process of change over time, descent with modification, and it can lead to new species, as we'll talk about next. Okay. Do you guys see the new slide here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is an example from the book. These are two birds, two kinds of this bird called a meadowlark. By appearance, they look the same. They actually appear in the same areas as well, but they have distinct songs and they don't breed with one another. So because they don't breed with one another, they are considered different species. So this is the biological definition of what a species is. You also might remember, perhaps in high school biology, if you have a horse and a donkey that mate with one another, you get this mule. Mules are sterile. They actually don't produce fertile offspring. So that's not something that's considered a biological species. That's separate from horses and donkeys. So in terms of evolution, you've probably heard about Darwin. So Darwin was very important for this because he and another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace, they both proposed this idea that organisms can change over time, over long periods of time, geological time, without any intervention from any higher power. This was actually a really revolutionary idea, and it's definitely still something that's, it's talked about a lot still here. So this is the idea of natural selection. So we talked about artificial selection when we talked about agriculture last week. The idea that you can select for corn with larger seed and shorter stalks and faster ripening time. In the same way, there can be natural selections. This is why Darwin used this phrase, natural selection, is because he was specifically contrasting it with artificial selection. The selection in his examples, they were all about like horse breeding and in agriculture as well. We have a lot of evidence for evolution from archaeology, from comparative morphology, and from molecular biology. So now we're going to get into some of the mechanisms of how evolution actually happens. So this is a little bit of the detail here. This is all in your book as well. So there's 4 mechanisms that we're going to talk about. These are all mechanisms that lead to changes in the genetic composition of a population. So the first one is mutation. This is the easiest one to think about, that you actually get a new gene that arises. So in this cartoon here, we have 2 beetles, and their genes here are they show they have green color. You can have a mutation, so a change in the DNA that just arises through recombination. So anytime you have sexual reproduction, there's the possibility for gene recombination and mutation. And in this case, in this cartoon example, that can lead to this brown coloration. So just because you have a mutation doesn't mean you have a new species. There's not speciation, isn't the result of a mutation, but it's something that can generate new gene combinations. So mutation is very important, but it's also pretty rare. And most mutations actually aren't things that are in any way adaptive or helpful for a species. They just generate variation. So mutations are things that simply generate variation. This is the raw material for evolution to work on. The next mechanism, it's a little bit abstract, but it's very important, is this idea of genetic drift. So again, we have these green and brown beetles here, and just by some chance event, like somebody stepping on some of them by sidewalk, you actually change the population composition. So the composition of the genes in the population. So we had 3 green and 6 brown in this example, and then through this random event, now we're reduced to 1 green and 6 brown. So any sort of random event that happens might be because of climate, might be because of a new predator coming in and just happens to take out some component of the population there. That changes the composition of the population, and that might change the fitness of the population. So this graph here is something that evolutionary biologists like to think about things in these like a landscape. So a little bit complicated, but focus on the y-axis here. This is fitness. So a high fitness means that each member of the population is likely to survive and reproduce. Low fitness means that there's less of a chance of reproduction and survival. So this is an abstract concept showing that you have different combinations, in this case of 2 genes, where there's a particular combination of these 2 genes that leads to high fitness, the peak, and one that leads to the bottom, low fitness. Genetic drift can cause the population to move around on this landscape, maybe in undesirable ways. So it's not a mechanism that leads to adaptation necessarily. It just changes the composition of the population. So another mechanism that's really important is migration. And in here, we're just talking about also called gene flow. Let's say you have brown beetles on one island and green beetles on another, and one brown beetle just happens to land on a log and floats across the ocean there. So that changes the genetic composition of that green beetle island by increasing these different gene variants. So it's not generation of new types of genes, that's mutation. And it's not exactly a genetic drift kind of mechanism, because it's something where it actually might be intentional. It might be something where like maybe the brown beetles are actually, they have really high fitness, and there's so many of them that some of them just happen to end up on logs, and they migrate over to this other island there. So this is migration or gene flow. This is another important mechanism. And last, this is really the most important one. This is the one that is really rooted in Darwin's ideas here, the idea of natural selection. This is the one that actually generates adaptive traits, that actually makes a population more fit. So natural selection almost always leads to higher fitness here. So natural selection is the process of inherited characteristics. So this is going across generations here, that enhance the survival and reproduction of the population. So this is the primary mechanism for adaptation, and generation of biological diversity. So in this example, again, we have this cartoon of green and brown beetles. And let's say that in this particular environment, the green beetles are more visible to the predators. So the predator, in this case, the bird, it sees the green beetles more easily, and so those are the ones that it eats. In the next generation, you have fewer green and more brown. Those brown ones are the ones that that are reproducing more. And so over time, the population shifts towards a brown composition. So in this cartoon example, this is the selective pressure is the predator, the bird, and it's causing the population to shift towards a brown coloration. So it's actually changing the genetic composition of the population in a way that increases fitness. All right, I hope that makes sense. So we'll talk about some more examples here. So we talk about natural selection as being parsimonious. So this word parsimonious means that it's the simplest explanation. So even though it seems like it requires a lot of complicated things, it requires that you have genes, it requires that you can pass characteristics on from one generation to another. It requires that you have a clear selective pressure like this bird predator. But this is the mechanism which can most simply account for the biological diversity that we see today. So as a counterexample, there was a scientist called Lamarck, and Lamarck had this idea that you can pass traits down from one generation to another just by the behavior. So the way that one individual acts changes the way that its offspring will act. So the classic example that he gave was how do giraffes have tall necks? How is it that you have this animal that has this really long legs and tall necks? So he said, well, it's because you have each individual in each generation is trying to reach higher and higher. And because it's trying to reach higher to feed on these acacia trees in the savannas, that the act of it reaching higher just somehow stretches the neck, and that makes it so its offspring will also have a longer neck. It's not a parsimonious explanation because there's no real mechanism. How do you transfer that behavior of stretching your neck from one generation to another? So natural selection is the parsimonious explanation. At the time in the early 1800s and mid 1800s, there were a lot of other people who were interested in the question of how do you generate biological diversity. They didn't have good explanations there. So are all traits adaptive? So this idea of adaptation is an idea that you have higher fitness in the generations following. So you have some sort of offspring which can be more fit to their environment there. So not all traits are adaptive. Some are vestiges of a previous environment or a previous condition. So one of the classic examples is mole rats, which are pretty interesting creatures. They have eyes. They have eyes which actually would sense light, but the way that they have evolved, they're always underground, they're always in darkness, and now they have a flap of skin which is actually covering their eyes there. So if you just encountered this animal and you had never seen any other animal which had eyes, somehow you'd say, why does it have this feature? Why does it have eyes which don't do anything for it? It's because it's a vestige of its previous environment, of when it was these above ground rodents, and then they became adapted to live underground, actually also in the savanna, because they needed to have an area which is free from above ground predators. So that's one example of a vestige. Another one is this tree. This is me touching this tree in Puerto Rico. It is an awesome tree, I agree. It's very cool. And the animation, well, when this was a slideshow, I was going to make you guess why it would have such big thorns here. So in Puerto Rico, there are no more mammals that are endemic to Puerto Rico except for bats. So bats are the only mammals which are considered endemic to Puerto Rico currently. Previously, about 10,000 years ago, there was a tree sloth that was there. So this tree is one of the trees that has adaptations to deal with mammals like this extinct tree sloth, which actually prevented or just strongly discouraged the tree sloths from climbing up its bark because it has this massive thorns. So now we see a tree that has this huge thorns. They do nothing. You know, there's no advantage to the tree there. In fact, there's a big cost to it because it has to take carbon away from making new leaves and new shoots, and instead it invests it in these big thorns here. So this is something which is considered it's maladaptive. It's a vestige of a previous environment, and it's one way where we can say, okay, if there was some being out there that was creating these organisms, why would it make more rats have eyes, and why would it have this tree in Puerto Rico that has these huge thorns here? All right. So
were the thorns just trying to protect the tree from the sloth eating their leaves, or
from crawling up climbing the tree? Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the thorns they're pretty sharp. Actually, right at the ends, the pointy parts are pretty sharp there. Yeah, so it would be it's a trait that discourages the sloths from climbing up the trunk. Yeah. So it hasn't been
break the
used
tree?
for 10,000. Say again?
Sorry. Would that break the tree? The weight of the sloth?
Oh no!
I'm just trying to wrap my
No,
head
you're
around
right. It's so that the sloth doesn't climb up and eat the leaves. So it's not that it would break it down, just to prevent the
Okay.
herbivore from consuming all the leaves there. Yeah, good question. Right. Okay. So moving on to this idea of speciation. So the idea of speciation is that there's two main ways that we think of species coming about, and the hard way is a mechanism called sympatric speciation. So sympatric speciation is the process of a new species arising in the same location as a previous species. So in this example, it would be, let's say you first had green beetles and then a blue species started arising in the same location. There are some examples of sympatric speciation that might actually be true, but most people think that this is a pretty rare mechanism. So much more common is allopatric. So allo meaning other in this case, and then the patrimony is like the place where they're from in this case. So allopatric speciation, there's a couple of ways that it could happen, but the main idea is that you have a single population which through some event becomes divided. So in this example, these actually are flies in Hawaii, and the idea is that you have some lava flow that comes in. So lava flow comes in, it divides the forest in this case, and then through this So I got a question. Can I repeat the definition of sympatric? So the definition of sympatric speciation is new species arising in the same geographic area as a previous species. So it's hard to think of good examples because actually most examples of speciation we believe are allopatric. One example of that sympatric speciation possibly could be the bird example. Let me skip back up to the bird we had here. So it's possible that these two bird species, the western and eastern meadowlark, they could have speciated. They could have become different species just because of the evolution of a different song. So their distinct songs lead to different breeding patterns. So it might have been that there was, let's say you started with all of the western meadowlark, And then there was some subpopulation that, for some reason, they came up with a new song. And that new song only was attractive to other members of that subpopulation. So since they only bred with one another, and the other group only bred with themselves, even though that they were in the same area, over time that could have led to speciation. Does that make sense? More or less. Okay. Let's skip ahead. Allopatric speciation is easier to grasp here because this is something which clearly you have some sort of event which divides the population. In this case, we have a lava flow. So it requires something that creates a geographic distinction between two populations. Then this, between steps 2 and 3 here, they're not showing it, but you actually don't need any natural selection. You can, just by the process of genetic drift, just because of random events, even without any selective pressures, given enough time, you could have new species arising here, just because they're in different areas and they have slightly different environmental conditions. Now let's say that lava flow has hardened and the forest recovers there. These isolated populations come together. If they can't breed and produce fertile offspring, they are now 2 different species. So this is allopatric speciation. So other examples of allopatric speciation come not from lava flows, but more from glaciers, glaciation. So there's lots of examples here, including in North America. We had, lots of different glaciation events. There's like the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. There are some species that spanned across all these mountain ranges. You had the glaciers that came in, it divided the populations. They only stayed up on the mountaintops there, and after the glaciers left, they became different species. Or they were interbreeding with one another. Okay, so that's allopatric speciation. So this is allopatric speciation. This is related to the idea that you can have selection that acts on some genetic variation. And these sort of speciation events often happen because of a process we call divergent evolution. So you can have closely related species, and then if they have different selective pressures, they can diverge. So there's this set of birds called the honey creeper in Hawaii, and they all seem to have common ancestors, but they eat different things. So some that feed just on the nectar of flowers, others that are generalist across everything, some only forage on the leaves, picking barks, seed and fruit eaters. So this divergence, so they had some sort of common ancestor, and they diverged into different species because there was a selective pressure for them to not compete with one another in terms of their food. So that's divergent evolution. Convergent evolution is a really interesting phenomenon. And convergent evolution happens when you have species that actually don't share any evolutionary history together, or maybe they do, but a really long time ago. Very unrelated species. But because of the environmental conditions that they live in are relatively similar, they can appear to have similar kinds of traits. So one example from the book is a cactus in Arizona. I think there's a saguaro, organ-type cactus. And there's a thing called a spurge in the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa. So they both have this hot, dry environment. It's an environment where you need to have very thick stems and conserve as much water as possible. So that with that similar environmental pressure, they actually come up with a similar solution. They both have this thick stem, a needle-like leaf, or the spines in the cactus, as a way to conserve the water in there. So this convergent evolution is something that leads to analogous traits. So what is an analogous trait here? So analogy comes from a similar solution to a problem through different structures. So if you think about the way that bats and birds fly, they both have this wing structure. But actually, the wing structure comes about in a really different way from bats and birds. So bats, basically, it's all about their fingers. So it's the skin between their fingers in here that forms most of the wing. Whereas in birds, they have feathers, which are a completely different structure. It's growing off of the flesh on the long arms of the humerus and almost there. So completely different solutions to a similar problem of I want to be able to fly around and eat things. So we can see in this is called a phylogenetic tree here. This tree, very cartoon-like, but it just shows that first you have evolution of 4 limbs, a so-called tetrapod. And then there's a divergence, and you end up with, we have mammals over here, mouse and bat. And over here we have the bird and reptile lineage, crocodiles and birds over here. But both the birds and the bats have these 4 limbs that can have this wing structure to allow it to fly. So these are analogous traits that result from convergent evolution. The opposite of analogous traits is homologous traits. And homologous traits are traits which have the same morphology, the same morphological structure, but very different characteristics. So again, if we go back to tetrapods here, so we have birds and whales, and I think this is supposed to represent a crocodile and a human. So actually they all share the same anatomical structure. So if any of you are taking human anatomy, you might know these words a lot better than I do, but the idea is that they all have a long top forelimb bone, humerus. They all have the ulnar radius, this sort of the longer front section of the forelimb, and then it ends in this hand and finger-like structure. So this is a really strong line of evidence for evolution because, again, really different usages, swimming, flying, mucking about in rivers, and then upright human anatomy. So really different characteristics, but they all have the same anatomy. And the most parsimonious, the simplest explanation is that there is common ancestry. Another example of homology from the plant world is in what you can do with a leaf. So I mentioned about cactuses, the spines of a cactus are anatomically, they're actually leaves. And poinsettia, the Christmas time flower that you might see, that those red things that you see, they're actually called sepals. They're not flower petals. They're actually leaves that have evolved to this bright red structure there. Venus flytrap, the leaf has adapted to become this really quick-moving hunting mechanism. And the pitcher plants, again, another thing that has a sticky liquid at the bottom, and when any sort of bug falls into it, the plant can digest that. And both of these, the flytrap and the pitcher plant, those are adaptations to low nitrogen environments. So they get a lot of their nitrogen from these animals just stumbling into their leaves there. So similar structures anatomically that have very different characteristics. That's a homologous trait. So like I said, the most simplest explanation is that there's some common ancestor for these things. So there's about 350 million years ago, which has been reconstructed from the fossil evidence, was the first tetrapod. And this diverged into all of the tetrapods that we have today, including the mammal lineage and the bird and reptile lineage. So we know that because of their shared traits, and now also from molecular evidence as well. So there's all this evidence in the fossil history of speciation events and and common ancestry. There's also evidence of mass extinctions. So the reason that mass extinctions are important in evolution is that when you have mass extinction events, these are events which really open up a lot of space. So thinking about it from the glass half full perspective, mass extinctions lead to the obviously killing off of a lot of species at once, and also the generation of biological diversity in the aftermath of that. So there is a background extinction rate. There is a background extinction rate, which can occur, again, just through chance events. It can occur because some species, its environment changes and it's not quick enough to adapt to it. And then there are these mass extinction events. So the one that you might know best is from this one that created this gigantic crater off the coast of Mexico, which we know pretty well now from fossil evidence, about 65 million years ago, and that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And only a lot smaller bodied animals that were more nimble and quicker to evolve were the ones that survived. So these mass extinction events are really important in the evolutionary history of the world because of the way that they lead to new biological diversity in their aftermath. So I want to talk about a couple of examples here relating evolution, in this case climate change, and then another one that's a little bit more applied in contemporary life here. So this is an example of research done by this woman, Jennifer McElwain from Ireland. And she works with fossils of a different sort. So not dinosaur fossils, but actually fossilized leaves. And her group works in Greenland, and they're especially interested in the leaf surfaces of these fossilized leaves here. So let's try to make this show up a little bit better. So these ancient fossils, the reason that they're interesting to her is because of the density of these things called stomata. So stomata are openings on the leaf surface of a plant that allow CO2 to come in, then photosynthesis happens, and as a result of photosynthesis, you have water and oxygen that leave. This is gas exchange in plants here. A really important feature of that is that if you have a high CO2 environment, you actually don't need as many of these openings. You don't need as many stomata. So in a high CO2 environment, the plant actually gets more CO2 coming in, and actually it's adaptive to have fewer stomata so that you lose less water and oxygen. And then the opposite, a low atmospheric CO2 environment, in that environment, it's adaptive to have a high stomatal density. You need more openings. Even though you're going to lose more water through these openings, you need that so that you can have CO2 coming in. Okay.
Keep going way up.
All right. Somebody's microphone's on. That's okay.
Going.
Oh,
It's lower. It's like, I mean, there's a bunch of different, like, pretty much or whatever.
Hi, can somebody turn off their microphone?
Wow.
Okay. All right. So through this examination of these fossilized leaf surfaces, there's a couple of really interesting relationships that have been observed by this group here. So one of them is that she's looked at stomatal density through time and lined it up both with CO2 levels in the atmosphere and also extinction events. So by examining these fossilized leaves, you can see that over time you have this decrease in stomatal density. So remember that under high CO2 environments, it's adaptive to have fewer openings in the leaves because you lose less water and you still get in a lot of CO2. Then there was an extinction event at the end of the Triassic. And after that, the stomatal density increased again. So because of her work looking at the leaf surfaces there, he was able to see that actually this lines up with an increase in atmospheric CO2 that peaked, and there was an extinction event followed by a decrease there. So this is one evidence for, in this particular case, the plant is like a canary in the coal mine. So the plant is reflecting the environmental conditions. And it's possible that this high CO2 peak here would have coincided with a temperature peak. And this might be one reason why this Triassic extinction happened. So this isn't the asteroid example I was talking about earlier. This is a different extinction event that may have been caused because of global warming.
What?
All right, so this is an example of the leaf surface. Fossilized leaf surfaces being useful for looking at climate history. And at the same time, it's not just the size of these openings, the density of the openings that she was researching, but also leaf size. And this was another piece of evidence that climate warming was the cause of this extinction event here. So in this example, in this research, it wasn't just the number of openings in the leaves, but actually the size of the leaf. So her research showed that up until this extinction event, there was a mix of larger and smaller leafed species, and after it, only the small leaf species. So the large leaf species are ones that would have suffered under this hypothetical climate warming because they have a lot more surface moisture a lot more rapidly. Okay. So another example, shifting gears away from fossilized leaves, is antibiotic resistance. And we talked about this a little bit in the last class here. So antibiotic resistance is obviously something that has a lot of public health relevance, and is something which really dramatically shows the role of evolution in health. So there's this one antibiotic, vancomycin. I actually don't know the mechanism of it, but it was really, after it got introduced in I believe in the late 80s, resistance to this antibiotic rose really rapidly, and especially in areas that needed it, like in these intensive care units. So the way that this resistance can occur, it's something that is not hard to imagine how that might happen. So thinking about the mechanisms of evolution that we talked about before, you have a bunch of bacteria, and then through mutation, you generate a new variety that just happens, in this case, to be resistant to this antibiotic. So this first step here is you need new genes. So this one requires mutation to happen. After an application of antibiotics, almost all of those non-resistant ones die out. This is a natural selection process here. And then the ones that are resistant are the ones that can reproduce most quickly. And eventually they're all resistant there. So if you have very strong selective pressure, in this case, the application of an antibiotic that eliminates basically everything that isn't resistant, then you very quickly can have the evolution of resistance to antibiotics. Now, one reason that bacteria are really good at evolving is because it's not just within one species, within one strain of bacteria, but actually they have this mechanism called horizontal gene transfer. And horizontal gene transfer, it's called horizontal because you can imagine in an evolutionary tree, the tips of the tree are independent from one another. Like when we had the tree that showed birds and bats and crocodiles and humans, we don't think of crocodiles as being able to transfer any of their genes to humans or to birds. Bacteria can do that, though. So bacteria have this mechanism by which they have a piece of their genetic material that's separate from their chromosomal material in a thing called a plasmid. And this little plasmid can actually transfer from one bacterial species to another one and copy itself. And it can be incorporated into the main chromosomal DNA of the other species. So horizontal gene transfer is one reason why bacteria are extremely fast to evolve resistance to anything. So how do you fight against resistance? So knowing about evolution in this case, we know that the bacteria are really good at evolving and they can really quickly deal with a strong selective pressure. So this is work done by a researcher named Carl Bergstrom and his group. And they were interested in applying this idea of cycling to hospitals. So the idea of cycling across drugs is something that that is done in HIV/AIDS treatment. So within a single patient, you apply some drug, the virus quickly adapts to that, or over some period of time becomes adapted to that, and you switch to a different drug. You cycle through different drugs. And eventually you can actually go back to the drug that you started with. So this researcher and his group, they came up with a mathematical model where they say, okay, what if you use all of one antibiotic for some period, and then after some number of months, you switch the whole hospital to a different one, and then you switch the whole hospital to a third one after that. What they found through their model, and then this was later shown to be the case through data, was that actually it was too quick. The bacteria were too fast at evolving. So you couldn't apply all of them at the same time. You couldn't apply one antibiotic across the whole hospital because the bacteria would very quickly become adapted to that. So instead, through the model, and again, some hospitals are now trying this, is actually in one time period, actually using all of the antibiotics at the same time. So this way, it's really different because now the selective pressure is different. So there's actually a smaller selective pressure for the whole population of bacteria because they're being exposed to different antibiotics. And then if you rotate within the hospital the application of where these antibiotics are used, you can actually slow the evolution of resistance to antibiotics. So this is a really interesting result that came first from mathematical modeling and then through data in hospitals. So this emphasizes both that it's important to know about the mechanisms of evolution, to understand how evolution occurs, and also to have multiple drugs available, to have a diversity of options there. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now. So that's the evolution section, and now we're going to shift gears into the population biology. So population biology is also referred to as population ecology. And population biology is concerned with the dynamics of an individual population within a species. So the distribution and abundance of individuals within a species. So in this figure here, we have some loggerhead turtles, and what we're supposed to be paying attention to are the 3 turtles there. That's the level of population biology. Community ecology is interested in the interactions between species. So in this picture, now we have the turtles, we have some corals, we got some fish there. That's the whole community. Ecosystem ecology goes up one more level of organization and incorporates not just the interactions between species, but also between the abiotic, the non-living components of the system. And ecosystem ecology is interested in this case, if you have a whole lagoon here, like the rate of nutrient cycling or the rate of acidification of the water there as driven in part by the interactions between species and the abiotic environment. And then finally, if you go up to not just this one lagoon, but across a whole chain of them, in an island, that's landscape ecology. And landscape ecology is interested in especially the patterns of these ecosystem properties, what's their distribution, and at the geographic scale. So today, for the rest of this class period, we're going to talk about population biology, some of the abstract concepts behind population biology. And then on Wednesday, we'll talk about community ecology. Okay, so in population biology, we're interested in predicting population growth or decline. This is the main thing of interest here. So trying to predict the dynamics of populations. And in your textbook, there's a story of monitoring bird populations in this one forest in Hawaii. And the way they conduct surveys of birds, they actually use something that's called mark recapture. Basically, you capture some birds, you put a tag on their leg, it doesn't hurt them in any way, and you release them. And then after some time, you come back to the same area, and again, you put up a net and try to catch birds. And if you see the same bird, then that's a good thing. If you have all new birds, then you know that you have actually a larger population than you originally accounted for. So there's a lot of sophisticated statistics that goes into estimating population size based on things like this mark recapture. And it's fun because you get to walk around the forest and carry around a big camera. Actually, I haven't never done this sort of work, but it seems like fun there. So what's the use of this sort of work? Well, you can, if you do it for a long enough period, you get these long-term data sets. So in this one forest in Hawaii, they show that actually their conservation efforts seem to be really good. They seem to be working really well over the long term. The long-term trend was an increase in the populations of native birds overall. But when they looked at in more detail, they saw that across this more recent 9-year period, some population were declining. So you need to have a lot of data to be able to detect something like this and separate it from the long-term trend there. So understanding how populations grow and decline is really important because you need to know, well, is it a decline? Is it just some statistical noise? Or is it something about the biology of the species that is leading to a reduction in their reproductive rate? So the rest of this section, we're going to talk about some, like I said, it's some pretty abstract ideas, but they're very important for understanding the dynamics of populations here. So if you just think about populations in the most, population growth in the most abstract way, the way you get growth is you can have births, you can have new individuals coming into a population, and then deaths or individuals leaving the population, emigration. And the balance of this is your population growth. This is always true, but it's not easy to figure out actually what is the birth rate, the immigration rate, death rate, and emigration rate. So as an abstract idea, this equation is useful, but it's not that useful because it's not actually useful for modeling population growth. You need to know more. You need to know what is the rate that individuals enter, especially through births, and what are the factors limiting population growth through deaths. So I'm going to show you two curves here, and we're going to get into something that's a little bit mathematical. The two curves that are most important in population biology are exponential and logistic growth. So exponential growth, it's growth without any apparent limits. And the bird shown here is a pigeon, and I believe is related to the passenger pigeon there. So if you remove limits to population growth, then you can have a curve that appears to go up in an exponential way. So with every passing generation, having a rate that's the same as the previous generation, so you increase exponentially. logistic growth is something which is a lot more common. Logistic growth is something that we can see experimentally, and we can see it also in the historical record, where you have a period of exponential growth up to a certain level. And the certain level that it reaches is what we refer to as the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a really important concept because this is saying what is the maximum size that a population could reach in this environment here. So there are limiting factors. We'll talk about some of these. They might be because of things like the resources that are available or the climate. They might be because of interactions with other species like predators or parasites, or disease pathogens. All right. This is an equation. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to really do any math here, but I do want you to understand the concept behind this equation here. So exponential population growth, if we break it down into words, I don't know if you've done calculus yet, but this is just rate of change. So the change in n in this case being the population size, the number of individuals, over the change in time. So this thing is just the rate of change of the population is equal to this little r, which is the intrinsic rate of increase, times the number of individuals in the population. Okay. This is exponential population growth. Is if all you have is you have the number of individuals in the population and you have a rate of increase, then it's just going to increase exponentially. That's all you need to know for exponential population growth. You can take this same equation, and if you add the idea of a carrying capacity, it looks like this. So again, we have the rate of change in the population, and what it equals is, again, it's the same intrinsic rate of increase times the number of individuals, and it's limited by K. So K is, in this case, the carrying capacity. So we can actually break it down. It's the difference between the number of individuals that you currently have and how far it is from this carrying capacity. So as the number of individuals increases, then this becomes a smaller and smaller number. So basically the available capacity for that population becomes smaller and smaller, and that reduces this rate of change. So I'm going to show you this in Excel to break it down in a little bit more of a concrete way here. Okay, so let's just see how this works. So can you guys see? All right, can you see the Excel sheet?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So I've shared this on the Moodle, so you can download this and see for yourself how it works here. So there's three parameters that we have in this kind of logistic growth. We have an initial population size, in this case 5. We have a rate of increase and a carrying capacity. What will happen if I change the carrying capacity? Now is the interactive period of the class. We'll see how this interaction works here. So how about, can somebody give me a number that I should type in here? So give through the chat function over here. Type in a number and I'll change it to that number. Okay, so 20 is the suggestion. Let's see what happens. Okay, so this actually still is the logistic curve here, but now it's capped out at 20. 2, same curve, now it reaches the carrying capacity over there. Okay, let's change the rate of increase here. So somebody give me a value to put in the rate of increase between 0 and 1. All right, 0.9 is the suggestion. So what do you think will happen when I hit enter here? It's still going to reach the same carrying capacity. It's still the same initial value. but now it reaches that carrying capacity a lot faster. So, yeah, exactly, right. So these parameters, we call them, so these values for this, again, it's very abstract. There's no biology really in here, but there's a lot of biological systems that fit this type of growth. So we can see this kind of growth in populations time and again, that they have some rate of increase. It actually looks exponential here, and then it slows down to the carrying capacity. So if you think about the equation that I showed you here, so the equation is written in terms of not what's the number of the population, but actually the rate of change. So the rate of change, if you think about that, is actually fastest in this period here. This is the time when the rate of change is at a maximum. So let's see if this makes sense here. So again, we have try to make it fit onto the screen a little bit better. So we have the same time scale along the x-axis here, and what's on the y-axis is the rate of change. So this is the change in the number of individuals per unit time. So we can see that the rate of change is at a maximum in this period. So if we change the carrying capacity like we did before, actually the rate of change changes place. This one doesn't show it as well because it's so low there, but it's at the midpoint there, at the part where it's flattest is when the rate of change is at a maximum. And if we go back here and increase it to a faster rate, again, so the rate of change is at a peak when that slope is at its steepest. Okay, one more example from this rate of change stuff. So the red line is showing, in this case, where the initial value is at 2,000. Okay, somebody give me a number that's above 2,000. Okay, 2001. Okay, so in this case, it's the same. The math is identical for the red line and the blue line. And yeah, you can't really see it. Let's try another one. Okay, so the math is identical. And again, it's the same function, it's the same logistic growth. But here, when the initial value is above the carrying capacity, the result of this logistic growth is to reach the carrying capacity still by a declining population size. Put in the 5,000 here. Same thing, you're starting way up at the top, and it quickly comes down to the same carrying capacity. Okay, so this sort of mathematical model is something that's actually used a lot by population biologists by fitting data to these curves. Because what they want to know is, let's say if we see these points, we have points that line up here, we want to know what's the carrying capacity that we might eventually be hitting. Or if we see a lot of points that are coming down and they seem to be reaching something like that, well, is it going to keep going down or is it going to flatten out, reach this carrying capacity? So these models are used often, not in the way that we're using them here, but by using statistics to fit these models to data. Okay, let's go back. So that's pretty much what I have for population growth. So think about these R and K. Shoot, this is supposed to be an animation. Okay, so with R and K, in this case, they have important consequences for the ways that species choose to reproduce, or choose is the wrong word, but the strategies that species have evolved. So we refer to K-selected and R-selected species. So species that have a K-selected population growth strategy are ones which are at K most of the time. So species which are at K, they stay at this carrying capacity most of the time, are ones which actually their population growth rate is usually quite low. So the growth rate is low, they're staying at K, at carrying capacity. So each individual offspring that they have has higher investment. Usually they have fewer total, and then for each individual they have a longer time to sexual maturity. Classic example is in whales. I mean, they have a crazy long gestation period, something like 36 months or something per calf. They have one at a time. So it's a huge investment to have one offspring there. The flip side of that is R-selected species. So R-selected, if we go back to this case, are species which are always in this phase, in this exponential growth phase. So they have very high rates of population growth. Usually they also have really high mortality too. That's why they don't reach their carrying capacity. So they invest relatively little in each individual offspring. Usually it's smaller body size as well, high reproductive rate, and a short time to sexual maturity. These are all features of R-selected species. So mice are relatively R-selected. Even more R-selected are things like beetles and mosquitoes, things that are fish. Most fish are very R-selected. They lay thousands and thousands of eggs and maybe don't even care for them at all. Compared to mice, and mice are relatively K-selected compared to fish in that way. So those are two different population growth strategies. Most things aren't just one or the other. These are kind of extreme examples here. But you can think about when you think about a species, how they reproduce, how much investment there is into each offspring, and that tells you something about the growth rate that they might be having at the population level. If we go back, I'm actually going to skip back a couple of slides here. What about frogs is a question. I think, well, frogs are interesting because for some species, I know that they lay their eggs actually, and they tend to them. So they don't lay so many that they can't take care of them. So I know there's some species that actually lay their eggs and the eggs stick to the back of the mother frog. So they're kind of a little bit not completely R-selected. Question, what does the R and R-selected stand for? That's a good question. So the R, it comes literally just from this mathematical model here, actually in this one here. It's the symbol that population biologists have been using for the intrinsic rate of increase. So the R is for rate in this case. Yeah, that's a good question. And the K is for carrying capacity. Humans, I would say, you know, for most humans compared to other species are very K-selected. We take a lot of, you know, there's a lot of investment in each individual offspring. You know, there might be a number of offspring over a lifespan, but it's not so many that we can't take care of them. One of the questions, population growth strategy used to compare one species to another. Yeah, they're used and they're most useful in a comparative way, thinking about what's the strategy of this species in the context of the other species that it interacts with. Are there case-selected species that have huge population growth? Well, you might have species that they should be case-selected, but maybe the population is relatively small. So if you think about going back again to this kind of growth rate, even with a case-selected species that normally is always around its growth capacity, carrying capacity, they might be in this exponential growth phase. So the rate of change might be high for a short period of time, but they stabilize at that carrying capacity. That's the definition of a case-selected species. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so just briefly, I want to talk about this idea of limiting factors, which in this cartoon is shown as a weight that's weighing down species and holding them at carrying capacity. So these limiting factors are things which are either density dependent or density independent. Density dependent factors are things which they come into play when the population reaches a large enough level. So things like disease, predation, and competition, these are all density dependent factors which limit population growth. They're also all biotic factors. They're all things related to interactions with other living. So why is disease, for example, a density dependent factor? Well, you can think if you have a high enough population density, it's very easy for diseases to transmit from one individual to another. So that's why that's considered a density dependent factor. Density independent factors are things which are outside of any, not dependent on biotic interactions. These are abiotic factors. Climate is the big one, and disturbance events, again, which are also usually climate related. There might be like an earthquake or mudslide, lava flow, or something like that. The question of are populations regulated more by density dependent or density independent factors was actually something that was really a big debate in animal biology for a long time. There's a whole sort of school of thought that said that actually density independent factors are the most important, and we only like to look at density dependent things because they're kind of interesting and related to interactions with other species. But actually, it's all about climate. If climate were different, then you could have more of everything. This is something which now is thought to be not the case for most species. Most populations, rather, are regulated largely by density-dependent factors, but there's an important role of density-independent factors. So both are important. It's just important to know what the distinction is between the two of them. Okay, and finally, I just want to make the shift from population biology into community ecology. And we'll talk about this more on Wednesday, but this is the idea of if you have population growth, you can have competition that's within a guild. So in this case, we have rabbits that compete with one another, and also predation across guilds. If we're interested in not just the rabbit, but also the lynx, so the population growth of both of these species, that's now in the realm of community ecology. We've now left pure population biology, and now we're getting into these dynamics of interactions between species, and that's a community ecology kind of question. So it's the science of interactions between species. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there for now, and then we'll pick up with community ecology on Wednesday. So I also just want to say I've been watching you guys using the Mastering Environmental Science quiz. This is the first time I'm using this online feature for the quizzes there. I know some of you had some technical difficulties, but most people seem to have been able to use it well enough. So I am going to keep using it. I have a quiz online now, which will be due before the following Monday's class, before next Monday's class, which is about population biology, evolution, and adaptation. So that's your homework for next week. So please do send me any questions or concerns you have about the use of that. It looks like it's working well for most people. There are some questions which are more related to textbook content rather than things I've talked about in class, so it's definitely important to do both. I have a question: do I drop the lowest quiz grade? That's not what I was planning on doing. I'm actually, the quiz grades are a relatively small part of your total grade. So, don't be, will the PowerPoint be on Moodle before the quiz are due? Yeah, the PowerPoint will be, I'll put it up in the next 10 minutes. So you can definitely refer back to that. I know that actually about half the class wasn't even on this little webinar here, so I am going to send out an email with a link after I post this recording, so everybody else can listen at their leisure. And I'll be at my office at S245 on Wednesday morning before the class. The quiz is graded on completion or accuracy. Well, yeah, you have to get questions right to get credit for it. So you get points for answering the questions correctly. In this case. I have a question. Already talked about the midterm a little bit. Sure. Question about the midterm. Ask away. Content. Content of the midterms will be, the material that we've covered up until that point. There is on the syllabus, I have a midterm review built into the class. So that is on the syllabus currently. So there is going to be a class period where we talk about exactly what the content is. And, if you've done the reading and come to the classes, I expect everybody should do pretty well on the midterm there.
All right, are we going to be applying like basic concepts, or will it be more detail oriented? Do we need to remember history aspects?
It's definitely conceptual. There's going to be some of answering sort of paragraph short questions in writing. There'll be a lot of multiple choice. There'll be some things where I show you a graph and ask you to interpret the graph. And as to whether it's more textbook or based on the content in class, most of the material I'm presenting in the lectures is based on what's in the textbook. I'm just adding more detail, and I'm trying to add some things which are outside of the lecture, outside of the textbook. So I wouldn't say it's more one or the other. Both are important there. So yeah, short essay questions, paragraph style, multiple choice, and interpreting figures will be the format of the midterm.
All right.
All right. Okay. Okay. Well, see you all on Wednesday in person, and thanks for joining. I think this was a good little experiment, and I think it worked pretty well. So thanks a lot.